There is on the hour, but I don't think we always hear it. And then at noon, they usually play the fight song in the alma mater, I think. Yeah, if the window's not open, we're not paying attention, we're talking, you're not gonna hear it. Alrighty, I'm gonna go ahead and share screen right away here today. All right. Bump this down to the bottom. And I wanted to just take a minute to touch base on Blackboard today, just so you're aware of everything you've got coming up here. All right, so perusals are all done, but you can keep turning them in until our exam period when we do our presentations. So catch up on those. I plan to catch up on grading those over the next few days as well and putting in my comments. Just a reminder that I post all my lecture PowerPoints here. And so all the PowerPoints and as Google Docs or Google Slides are here. Recordings of class, I'm a little behind on. They're posted on YouTube if you find my YouTube channel, but I haven't linked them over yet. But yeah, if you just search Taryn Myers on YouTube, you can find everything. So let me just show you all that real quick. Because there's actually a whole playlist for your class, so. It's probably whether I click the box or not, honestly. Yeah, exactly. So if I forgot to click it, that's where it is. So yeah, like 313, I'm probably missing some, for example. So yep, there's a whole playlist for 202. And like Debbie was saying, if I've forgotten to click that box, every video I've ever recorded is here. So I love the thumbnails. Like this one's great. That was perfect for me having to be home. So those might help as you prepare for the exam on Monday as well. Assignments. So all the assignments for the second half of class are posted here. The sources for your topic was from the beginning of class. So if there are some of these you haven't done, go ahead and catch up with them. Some of them were stuff that we did together in class, like the retracted paper thing. And then I sent you an email about this, but just to kind of catch you up on this. So as part of just being an academic institution, each department is responsible for assessing how well we're doing at teaching them. And so as part of that, you all are sort of the pre-test, since this is the intro to the major class. And then you will complete these again in 495 if you are a major. These are just how we're keeping track of how well we're teaching you. Full disclosure, ideally, these should have been done at the beginning of our class, but Dr. Jackson and I forgot. So we're fixing it by doing it now. But next semester, Dr. Ariel will do them first. So when you finish the surveys, they won't take you very long. There's a code, and if you stick that in, this is an assignment, so either put it in the comments or the place where you would submit a body of work. I'll give you credit for doing it. I won't see your answers, but I'll just know you've done it, if that makes sense. So then you get some points for doing it. Review sheets. I posted the review sheet for exam 4. So that's up there now. Should be similar to, more to exam 2 than exam 3. Because again, I'm gonna try to have more actually short answers. But in terms of the length of multiple choice and short answers should be comparable. It is Monday. So we will cover our last chapter today and Friday. And then on Monday, you have your last exam. And then we don't meet again until I believe the following Monday for our presentations. Let me double check I'm right about that. Yes. So we're just a little spread out there. But yeah, so Monday is our last day of class. Because next week we only have class Monday and Tuesday, and then reading day is Wednesday. So, and it's why it's like that is because we started the semester on a Wednesday. So essentially they just wrap it back around for like places that have labs and things like that need to catch up. So that is the review sheet. Here is where you can turn in those psychology experience credits. Remember, if you didn't get a chance to do the SONA studies, you can just do summaries of articles. Yeah.
So I just did one of them yesterday,
Mhm.
and I got here, and the researchers never showed up.
Okay.
So Dr. Ariel gave me the credits for it.
Okay.
But
I would say do it based off the description of the study on the
Okay.
SONA page. And do the best, and you can write genuinely about your experience as the researcher, not showing up. Usually the opposite happens. Usually the participants don't show up. And whenever one of my research students comes to me, they're like, Dr. Myers, my participant didn't show up. I told them, congratulations, you're a real researcher.
I slept in my alarm. My mom woke me up half an hour before, maybe 9:30. And I do not, I can't just get out of bed and go with my help. And so I was like, this is important to somebody, so I have to do it. And like, it was
I'm glad you tried to come for them, and it just sometimes it doesn't work out. I'm glad Dr. Ariel gave you the credit. That's great. Alrighty. Then here is where the poster template is, and where you actually will turn in your poster. So if you want me to look those over before the presentation, get them in at some point. If you don't care, then you can turn them in on the 13th. That's fine. Again, trying to be as flexible as possible. So and then I sort of abandoned the links and videos thing since they're all in the PowerPoints. So that's where you'll find the links to the videos. All right, there's a preview. Boop, boop. Okay, so we have, I think, just like 3 slides left. We did this one on Monday, but I thought we did it too quickly. So we'll go over this one again. And then we'll get into our last lecture for the semester. And this last one is kind of fun. I had a lot of fun prepping it because your chapter just sort of like tangentially talks about what you can do with a psychology major. And so I pulled a lot more information on that for y'all. All right, so if misinformation is expected, you think someone's going to spread it. Say there's a new, very contagious variant of a pandemic disease, right? And what you might try to do is what they call pre-bunk or inoculate people against it. So this is what you've seen President Biden, Dr. Fauci doing on TV, saying like, we should be concerned, but don't panic, and explaining people really need to get their vaccines, right? I don't know how helpful that will be, but at least they're trying to pre-bunk, right? And they're trying, another thing you can do with pre-bunking is try to like explain how other people are going to mislead you. And sometimes that helps, sometimes it doesn't. So, but if the misinformation is already out there, like a lot of stuff we've talked about this semester, you need to kind of look, how visible is it? If it's largely unknown, it's something like flat earthers or people thinking the moon landing isn't real, right? You just sort of ignore it, right? You don't like keep monitoring. You don't need to go into a huge debunk. If it has traction, say like COVID vaccines are going to kill you, but the virus won't, right? I just can't with the anti-science. We need to think about how it's framed, and is that framing the same? Are they always presenting the same argument, or does it change? So if setting an agenda is possible, provide accurate information without debunking so that you are the one setting the agenda. But if they're just repeating the same message over and over, then you want to debunk properly and often, and in a couple slides, I'm going to go through this bottom part. in more detail, because it shows you exactly how to go about trying to debunk something. All right, so one of the things they talk about that we have to be wary of as we try to debunk and dissuade people from believing these falsehoods is the backfire effect, which is where trying to debunk, trying to give people a correction, inadvertently increases the belief in or reliance on this misinformation relative to, before you gave the correction or, no correction. So this plays into all those cognitive biases we talked about all semester, right? That people are really fixed in their beliefs. It tends to be sort of the me first, thinking of how things affect me and my beliefs, and it's really hard to change them. So if you do this two in your face, just yell at them, or just say like, oh my God, how could you believe that, right? It could backfire and they could end up believing the falsehood more. And that's why this debunking handbook tries to give you ideas for how to do it correctly. But what they show here is, if you have the misinformation presented repeatedly, the more something's repeated, the more familiar it feels, the more correct it feels, even if it's incorrect. And if you try to debunk, then you would end up, if you overwhelm that familiarity effect, it can cause this backfire. So debunking a myth can actually make it more familiar. So that can kind of, because you're just talking about it more, right? But typically, debunking can sort of overcompensate. So this is, I think, the most helpful thing in this reading, in the debunking handbook. And that is how to successfully debunk. So you want to lead with the fact. Make it clear, make it pithy, make it sticky. Simple, concrete, plausible. It has to fit with an overall story, but you want to lead with the truth. And then warn them that a myth is coming, mention it only once, then you want to explain that fallacy. How does the myth mislead you? And then you finish by reinforcing the fact multiple times if possible. Again, that starts to increase the familiarity of the truth, right, over the falsehood. And make sure it provides an alternative causal explanation. And this is where it feels yucky for psychologists, right? Because we know correlation is not causation. We know that sometimes we can't draw these conclusions, but if we can kind of say it's a possibility, right, then we can show that person there's an alternative. So start with just the facts, warn that you're going to mention the myth, mention it only once, explain why that myth is misleading, and then finish by reinforcing the truth of that fact. And the debunking handbook reading that's on Perusal has a lot more detail about how to do these as well. But I just think this chart is super helpful. Okay, so now we're switching to our last lecture for the semester. All right, so this chapter is reflections on thinking like a psychological scientist. So it's really about thinking in psychological ways, but also like ways that psychology itself is beneficial. So I have a few videos to get us kicked off here. And this first one is from the American Psychological Association, and it's part of their campaign. So APA has their offices in DC. They're actually near Union Station there. And that's on purpose because APA does a lot of lobbying where they will actually go to Capitol Hill, try to advocate for mental health issues, for like parity and insurance so people get their mental health coverage covered, for how psychological science can help inform decisions, And so this is part of their series trying to get other people involved in advocating for psychological science.
Can one person change the world? It's not only logical, it's psychological. It took a psychologist to show that segregation damaged self-esteem in Black children. Testimony to the Supreme Court that helped desegregate America's public schools. That the right design of a push-button keypad makes dialing fast and accurate. That massage therapy on preemies can save $3,000 per hospital stay. That no two people have the same fingerprints. That teaching people to change behaviors can prevent teen pregnancy and HIV. That a lime yellow fire truck is safer than a red one. And now it takes you to keep changing the world, one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one message at a time. When you share what you know on Capitol Hill, you keep scientific research alive. You improve public health, physical health, mental health. Your expertise moves the process forward. Stop talking, and we all lose. So do it for you, them, us, and all of us. Because when psychologists affect change, they affect America.
So, some of the things that we're showing there, we've already talked about in terms of changing health behaviors. But one of the things I wanted to mention that they talk about is grants, right? So a lot of grants that psychologists get to do their research come from the government, whether it's NIH, NIMH. There are other departments within the government that might provide grants. So like I am a consultant on a grant that was submitted to the DoD, for example. So that's another thing that psychologists have to do is advocate for that money not to be cut. You can sometimes get funding from private sources. They're more likely to fund, things like vaccine trials or medications, right? You have to really make a case, but it's possible.
Can one person change the world?
All right, so the next one is talking about a theme we keep coming back to, and that is whether psychology is really a science. If you're interested in more about this, the same professor has a longer video about this, but I chose the shorter one just to fit more comfortably within class time. I think if I recall, yeah, there's like 30 seconds of titles here. There we go.
Hello and welcome to the JISC Psychology podcast series. I'm Dr. Keon West of the Institute of Psychological Sciences at the University of Leeds, and I'm here to talk to you today about whether or not psychology is really a science. All right, so to talk about whether or not psychology is really a science, I'll have to cover a few things first. I'll have to talk about what a science is, and of course in doing that I'll also have to talk about what a science is not. And then I'll talk about what psychology is, and then of course I'll have to also talk about what psychology is not. And then after that I'll give you a few examples of what I do when I do psychology, so that you understand how we do psychology, especially here in Leeds at the Institute of Psychological Sciences. If you look up the definition of the word science in multiple dictionaries, you'll get something that looks more or less the same as you go across them. I'll give you an example here. That's science, a noun, the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. And the physical and natural is in brackets there, because what I'm trying to emphasize is that yes, all we study is in the physical and natural world, but if there were any other worlds to study, you could study them scientifically as well. It's not limited to just the physical and the natural world. And again, we see a second one, systematic knowledge of the physical or material world gained through observation and experimentation. So science refers to that body of knowledge that you get through observation and experimentation. Those are the key words in that definition. Science is about knowledge gained through observation and experimentation. So if science is about knowledge gained through observation and experimentation, that means that science is about demonstration and justification. if in science you make a claim, so you make the claim that spending time with people from other groups makes you like those groups more, you have to be able to demonstrate that this is the case, and to justify what you have said by backing it up with experimental data, any kind of observable, verifiable facts. Science is also about studying the world, so you can study anything that exists in any realm of reality or in any way, and you can study it scientifically. Science is also about testing hypotheses. So if you have a question, any kind of question that has an answer, science can give you a factual answer to it. And science, of course, is about increasing understanding. And this is very important. There is the perception among some that scientific views are stable, but of course they're not stable. They can't possibly be stable. We're always increasing our understanding of the world. We're always increasing our knowledge. And with every new advance we make, we have to change our knowledge, and we have to change our belief set in accordance. So what is believed by scientists today should not be what is believed by scientists 100 years from now. We should always be making advances.
So if you want to watch the full video, it kind of really emphasizes a lot of the things we've already talked about this semester. You can follow these links. But essentially, as we've talked about, psychologists do science, right? We look at human behavior and sometimes animal behavior, right? Through the lens of science, just as, you know, someone doing biology or chemistry might, right? So this next one I'm going to show, I think, helps to tie this into the lay understanding of psychology, right? If you tell anyone you know you're majoring in psychology, they'll be like, oh, you can be my therapist later, or don't analyze me, right? Things along those lines. Yeah, I see some heads shaking. Yeah, I remember this. And so this is Dr. Ali Mattu. He is a clinical scientist who is also a YouTube, I would say, like, very minor celebrity. But he is going to talk about sort of psychological thought in clinical psychology.
When someone finds out I'm a clinical psychologist, the #1 question I get is, are you analyzing me? It's also the #1 question you want me to answer. Here's the honest answer. Yes, I am, and no, I'm not. Let's start with the yes. As a clinical psychologist, I focus on understanding thoughts, feelings, and actions that are out of the ordinary. If I see someone in public moving in unexpected ways, speaking loudly, and saying things that don't make sense, my training kicks in. I automatically question if they're under the influence of a drug, or are experiencing a manic episode of bipolar depression, have a tic, or something else. I can't help that. When I see something out of the norm, it automatically triggers a network of memories related to everything I've learned about clinical psychology. This is how memory works, and we all have some kind of unconscious bias. But let's replay what I just said. I automatically question if they're under the influence of a drug, or are experiencing a manic episode of bipolar depression, have a tic, or something else. Notice how I couldn't give you an exact explanation of what's happening? I can't understand what you're thinking and feeling just by looking at you. I need to know what's going on in your head and what you're experiencing in your body. The only way to find that out is by asking you. This gets us to the no part of my answer. As a clinical psychologist, people come to me because of problems. Not feeling like yourself, a lot of fights with a partner, school or work isn't going well, or you can't do something you need to do. Stuff like that. I ask questions and eventually figure out a diagnosis. Maybe it's anxiety, depression, an eating disorder, or something else. But a diagnosis is just the beginning of my work. A diagnosis tells me a lot about the problems you're experiencing and what type of treatments might work, but it doesn't tell me anything about why you're experiencing these problems or how I can customize a treatment to fit your needs. That's why I dig deeper, and that's where the real analyzing comes in. I talk to my patients about their past to identify origins to their problems. Things like a genetic risk, important events in their past, what their family was like, where they grew up, and important parts of their culture. I'll also ask about precipitants, recent changes that might have triggered these problems or made these problems worse. But the real magic of a clinical psychologist is how we identify mechanisms. Mechanisms are the things that cause your problems. Think of them like an engine. When this engine turns on, it causes all these problems to occur. This engine was built up over time by these origins and was turned on by the key found in your precipitants. Remember when I talked about my own social anxiety disorder? Here's how it looks graphed in this conceptualization. What's super important to understand is the same problem can be caused by different mechanisms.
This is, yeah. I think
Lots
that
of
somebody-
parents
I'll
come to
cover
me
it,
because
but-
their kid is misbehaving in class. But misbehaving could be caused by a number of mechanisms, like difficulty organizing information that is being taught during class, not getting enough sleep, getting attention from other students, feeling unsafe around others, trying to suppress thoughts that might be popping up in your head, or maybe something else. I know I keep saying maybe something else, but that's human behavior. It's complicated, and it's hard to find one simple explanation for why anyone does what they do. I'll make a decision about misbehaving mechanisms based on what the kid has told me, their parents' perspective, what the school says, the current scientific research on the topic, and my experience treating these problems. Then in treatment, everything I do will target this mechanism, the root cause of the problems. This whole process, it's all collaborative. My patient and I do it together. I don't keep secrets from my patients when it comes to what I think is causing their problems. I'll tell them what I think is going on and check in with them to see if it makes sense given what they're experiencing. I might be the expert on clinical psychology, but they're the expert on them. This is why I hate the question, are you analyzing me? I can't analyze you without you because I can't read your mind, and I would never even try to do that without your permission or your cooperation. This is why psychologists are prohibited from analyzing public figures. Seeing someone on TV doesn't give you any information about what they're thinking or feeling, and without their permission, it's unethical to even try. Some clinical psychologists
You guys, a little sidebar on that. A lot of people, when President Trump got elected, wanted me to speak about like, oh, what disorder does he have? And I was like, I ethically am not allowed to do that because I haven't interviewed him, right? And people were sort of boggled by that.
Psychologists hate this question so much that they'll pretend to be someone else in social situations. Seriously, here's an article about a colleague of mine who tells people he's an accountant when he's sitting on the airplane because he just doesn't want to deal with this whole issue. The next time you meet a clinical psychologist, please don't ask them if they're analyzing you. They're not. Instead, ask a more open-ended question like, what's it like to be a psychologist? I promise it'll lead to a much more interesting conversation. What questions do you have?
So his channel is great. He has a lot of like early career advice, things along those lines. Like what grad school should you go to? So highly recommend him. And as you can see, he's very conversational. So, and I've met him and he's super nice in person too. That doesn't always happen. So in terms of science, we know psychology is a science. And one of the things that your chapter really focuses on for the first third or so is doubters in sciences. So I was gonna throw it out to you all and I'll open the chat for our folks on Zoom. What are some non-pandemic, because we know that one, but examples of doubters of scientific ideas or innovations, and they can be psychological or they can be just regular sciences. Yeah, just in general, anti-vaxxers, you're right, Will, for sure. Yeah.
Evolution versus creation. though.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's the Creation Museum, right, where humans are hanging out with dinos. Yes, climate change is like a huge one, and your chapter talks about that, right, and how problematic it is. Yeah, climate change deniers. Oliver just said the same thing. It's definitely huge, right? And it's absurd given the agreement of science in this area, right? If we think back and back and back, right? Your book has some examples, like Galileo. So if you're not familiar, Galileo believed the Earth revolved around the sun, which we now know is true, but at the time was revolutionary, and they thought it was heretical because they thought like God created the world, and so it's perfect. So of course everything else revolves around it. Yeah, Tasty, I think that could be on there too. Like the people who believe in miracles instead of doctors. I think that if you're a person of faith it can actually help as you go through the medical process, right? But it's like that joke I told before about the people who like get to heaven and they're like, why didn't you send help? And God's like, I sent a helicopter, right? Yeah, like if your faith says you should look for help and there's a medical professional placed in your path that will help you, then I think those things can go together. But yeah, there are certain sects or religions that do not believe in medical anything, honestly, which is really scary. And yeah, that can definitely be part of this, right? It can lead to people dying of preventable diseases, unfortunately. One of my favorite Galileo quotes, I'm gonna have to paraphrase, but he said something along the lines like, I do not believe the same God who imbued us with reason and intellect would intend us to forego their use, right? So kind of along those same lines. Alan Turing, who can tell me who this guy was, what he did? Anyone ever seen the movie The Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch? All right, so Turing was really one of the early computer programmers, basically. And during World War II, yeah, he helped work on and really pioneer this computer system they called Enigma that deciphered Nazi codes. So they worked on this for a long time, and they were like, the code kind of switched that the Nazis were using, so they were trying to figure out how to do that, and the computer was supposed to help them do things more quickly. And what they finally figured out is they needed like a keyword that was the same in every message. And because it was Nazi Germany, the keyword they figured out every message started with was Heil Hitler, right? So they used that as their keyword and were able to decipher these codes and actually prevent a lot of destruction, save a lot of allies' lives, and help turn the tide of the war. Now, Alan Turing was gay. And in the UK, which we tend to think of as a fairly liberal nation, in the 1940s, that was considered not okay. There was something horribly wrong with you. So this great man that basically helped us win World War II was chemically castrated, which means they gave him medications so that he couldn't get sexually aroused. And eventually he died by suicide because of it. So, I mean, here's someone that, like, at first people were even skeptical about his science, right? But also just because of who he was, he's been discounted. Let's see, there's a couple good comments here. You do have to think about why some people doubt scientists. A lot of them have been through situations, race-wise personality, where science failed them and never admitted it. Yes. And Will also said that's a lot of the reason why people turn away from religion. Yes, this is so important. And this is why the APA put out that statement about all the times they effed up, right, in terms of racial things. I know on exam 3, a lot of you were like, Jesus Christ, is this thing real? And the example about the study about people from like Fiji was, yes, copy pasted from the APA timeline of like the horrible things psychologists did. It's just a first step, as we've talked about. Yes, and we need to fully acknowledge there have been times where scientists have really screwed people of color, people who were considered feeble-minded, which were people with any mental disorder or developmental delays, Native individuals, just completely screwed them over. And so like the movie Hidden Figures is another example of people who like were discounted, sort of ignored because they were not who we tend to think of as the heroes, right? And there's a great book we'll watch. Yeah, I think we'll get to it today. We'll watch a little video about in a couple slides called Even the Rat Was White, that talked about this history in psychology, right? The fact that like a lot of our populations did not include people of color. I mean, honestly, they also didn't include women for much of our history. And things along those lines. Yeah, so we talked about climate science. And then I think the other thing that's been an issue for a while, and we're just seeing it rear its head in a different way now, around the issue of critical race theory, right, is deciding what is taught in schools, right? So unfortunately, it's often politicians, not educators, who get to decide whether or not something can be covered in schools. So there's a lot of reasons why there might be resistance to science and scientific advancement. One is, in our country, there's a general anti-intellectualism among some segments of the population. I don't think it's the entire population. But essentially, they have dismissed education, and in particular higher education, as liberal brainwashing. My favorite is whenever something like this comes around, just seeing all the people on academic Twitter kind of laughing, right? Like, if I could actually brainwash my students, they'd turn their stuff in, right? Things along those lines. We don't brainwash you guys. We try to teach you what is equivalent, what is relevant, and the new science, and empirically supported. And for a lot of reasons, a lot of people don't believe in that. Some people see it as anti their religion. So we're harking back to Galileo, right? And some people just, sometimes if you don't understand something, you don't want to process it. It's the same thing as sort of like the natural foods movement, or people are like, don't eat anything, or you can't pronounce the ingredients. And it's like, if you take water and like pull it dihydrogen monoxide, right? Like, does that become problematic? And it can be, but don't eat anything with chemicals, and you're literally not going to eat anything, right? Because like everything's made of chemicals. Non-scientific belief systems are in opposition. So as I just hinted, religion, but also again political. Sometimes people might not actually be anti-intellectual, but they know it'll get them votes, right? So they're going to say that stuff. And then sometimes philosophical. So psychology came out of philosophy. Psychologists were in philosophy departments, and they were just the people who said, rather than just like conjecture about how the human mind works, why don't we try to figure it out empirically? And they actually started doing experiments. Philosophy is still sort of resistant to that in some ways. That's not true of all of philosophy, right? But there are some things that still like push back on. I can think of someone on a student eval a few years ago wrote something like, the professor tries to break everything down to science, and I just don't think we should be doing that. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry that you shouldn't be a psychology major, right? Like, I mean, there's only so much I can do in those situations, right? Ideologies. So your book defines these as organized sets of beliefs or attitudes, often deriving from an external authority. So these can come from religion, for example, or they can come from a political leader, or someone else that you look up to. And so there's lots of different ways these could oppose science, obviously. Another thing your book mentions is what's called cultural cognition, which is a way of thinking where members of a group tend to perceive facts, risks, or other phenomena in a manner consistent with their own moral values. So everything they read, regardless of what it actually says, for example, they interpret as supporting their beliefs. And so I have a very brief video talking about some of this.
My colleagues and I are very interested in why people are in a state of persistent disagreement about issues of fact. Is the earth heating up or not? Does allowing people to carry guns make crime rates go up or go down? People with different kinds of cultural styles have different views. Cultural cognition is where people are looking at data, looking at evidence, looking at facts, and they're seeing in it the information that vindicates the position that their group has in opposition to some other group. If I fall out of line with the position that predominates in my group, I could be in big trouble. What happens is people are going to seek out information that's more consistent with what they believe and dismiss and steer clear of the rest. I think these kinds of conflicts are becoming more spectacular. consequences are higher probably than they've been in the past, and in any case, they're intolerable.
So yeah, we see that there are violent outbreaks due to some of these things, and if nothing else, just it puts us at odds with people and not to be able to communicate with them, right? The other problem we have is that we tend to view things ethnocentrically, and I believe that America is sort of the champion of this. So this is a tendency to elevate your own culture as the standard by which to judge others. So any data you collect about people from another culture, you interpret as seeing people as inferior to you. And so this is, it says a 5-minute history lesson, but it's more like 10, but I'm gonna let the whole thing play because this is based on that book, Even the Rat Was White, and it talks about some of the hidden figures in psychology, which I think is really, really important because again, these folks have been overlooked.
In the 1930s and 1940s, Black children living in the American South experienced both explicit and implicit racism and persecution every single day. Schools were segregated according to race, as were neighborhoods, churches, restaurants, movie theaters, swimming pools, playgrounds, and even water fountains. Public lynchings still occurred, and legal efforts to end such horrific events by making them a federal crime were repeatedly defeated by Southern senators. Robert Val Guthrie was born on Valentine's Day in 1930 in Chicago, but he grew up in Kentucky, where his father was a high school principal. Guthrie remarked that to list or recall specific examples of racism during that era would be like asking an innocent prisoner to list examples of unfair treatment during incarceration. Guthrie wrote that it was far more meaningful to recall those rare instances of kindness, which suggested to my young mind that the mean-spirited behavior might not be the feature trait of all Southern whites. When Guthrie graduated from high school in 1948, he traveled to Tallahassee, Florida, to attend Florida A&M College for Negroes, as it was called at the time. Guthrie attended Florida A&M on a music scholarship, playing the clarinet in the band. And it was there that he first encountered psychology in a course from Joseph Acard, a World War II veteran who also taught a course in the history of psychology that greatly influenced Guthrie. Acard decried psychology's obsession in studying the differences in people, especially in the way that the science was used, almost always without real evidence, to reinforce racial prejudices. Guthrie's studies at Florida A&M were interrupted when he joined the Air Force and fought in the Korean War. He returned stateside in a posting to Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. Here, he met Elodia Sanchez. They were married and had 6 children. After his military discharge, Guthrie returned to Tallahassee, finishing his degree in 1955. In 1954, the landmark Supreme Court decision Brown versus the Board of Education rendered racial segregation in schools illegal. As such, the University of Kentucky graduate programs were, for the first time, open to African American students. So Guthrie returned to Lexington to begin his graduate work in psychology. All of his professors were white. After receiving his master's degree from the University of Kentucky, Guthrie traveled west to San Diego, California, where he eventually earned his doctorate in psychology in 1970 from the United States International University. Guthrie's career saw him accept academic positions at Mesa College in San Diego, the University of Pittsburgh, and Southern Illinois University. He also worked as a full-time researcher at the National Institute of Education in Washington, D.C., and at the Navy Personnel Research and Development Center in San Diego. It was while Guthrie was working in Washington, D.C., that he made his most important contribution to the field of psychology, a contribution that was so significant that it changed the very landscape and the history of American psychology. This contribution was a book published in 1976, entitled Even the Rat Was White, A Historical View of Psychology. In some ways, the book had been percolating in Guthrie's mind since his days as an undergraduate student at Florida A&M.
I was at least looking at those scholars in there, because I was looking at PhD, EDD type people. But for the most part, my professors were little known and not very formally educated. I mean, they had college degrees, but they didn't have PhD degrees. Well, they couldn't have a PhD degree.
He wondered about the lives of these professors, what educational opportunities were open to them, what barriers kept them from pursuing doctoral work, and if they had earned advanced degrees, what employment opportunities were open or closed to them.
And I know that when integration, racial integration came about, the Brown decision, and they were able to see us going to the schools where we were supposed to have been in the South, I could see them. I look back on it and I think about when Jackie Robinson must have gone to the major leagues, and the old guys who were too old to go, but were so happy that you're going. Well, I was under that kind of thing, where these guys who had dreams not only deferred, but were raisins in the sun.
In 1969, Guthrie read an article in the journal The American Psychologist that began with the sentence, "Little is known about the origins, education, and training of Negro psychologists." Like a voice from beyond, it called to him, and he knew what he needed to do. He had to fill that void. And so for the next 6 years, he bored into psychology's past, looking for those that had been forgotten. He was determined that he would tell their stories. When published in 1976, the book was in 2 sections. The first section of the book dealt with the history of racism, detailing especially American psychology's role in using psychological science to reinforce and perpetuate the myth of white supremacy.
I just want to stop for a minute and let you take that in. That he published this in 1976, and it took till 2021 for APA to acknowledge it, right?
Guthrie noted that this science was always suspect. While this analysis of what Guthrie called scientific racism was an important contribution to our understanding of psychology's history, it was the second section of the book which is arguably the more meaningful contribution.
The great arrogance of the present is to forget the intelligence of the past.
Guthrie went looking for early black psychologists who were wholly absent from the textbooks of the history of psychology. Did these individuals exist? If so, what did they accomplish? The second half of the book provides biographical accounts of 21 black Americans who earned their doctoral degrees before 1946. The first of these was Francis Cecil Sumner, whose doctorate was from Clark University in 1920 under the supervision of G. Stanley Hall, one of the founders of American psychology. Sumner would spend most of his career at Howard University, where he chaired the psychology department and influenced several black psychologists who would achieve national fame. To understand the rarity of Sumner's doctoral degree when he received it in 1920, realize that he was only one of 11 blacks with PhDs out of more than 10,000 doctorates granted by American universities between 1876 and 1920.
That's any field.
Guthrie's book told of Inez Beverly Prosser, who earned the first psychology doctorate by an African-American woman in 1933. Of Charles Thompson, who edited the Journal of Negro Education for more than 30 years. Of Albert Sidney Beckham, whose work on intelligence was critical for educational programs and institutions that served intellectually challenged youths. Of Ruth Howard, whose study of the development of triplets was the first of its kind. Of Martin David Jenkins, whose work on intelligence demonstrated that the range of IQ scores for blacks and whites was comparable. And of James Arthur Baton, who became a national expert on marketing, and as a result did research and consulting for many prestigious corporations, including Chrysler, Eli Lilly Pharmaceuticals, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, and IBM. The brief biographies also described the work of Mamie Phipps Clark and her husband, Kenneth Clark. Together, their research changed the course of American history, influencing the outcome of what many historians consider to be the most important Supreme Court decision of the 20th century. That work began when Mamie Phipps was a student at Howard University in Sumner's psychology department. She used a set of brown, white, and black dolls in the now famous studies that dramatically illustrated the negative effect of segregation on the self-esteem of black children. These studies were cited in the Brown versus the Board of Education case that declared separate but equal was not equal. But it can be argued that no single piece.
So we'll stop there and we'll pick this back up on Friday. But one thing I want you to note, I'll go back like a couple frames here, is when they're showing this
These studies were
citation,
cited in
the citation is attributed to Kenneth Clark, who is Mamie's husband, right? So even though she's the one who came up with this idea and they worked on it together, there was also, she had this intersectional problem where she was Black and female, and so her work was further discounted. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind as well. Alrighty, well, thank you so much. And we'll finish watching this and get to the rest of our lecture on Friday, including talking about ways that psychology can benefit your future career. So, look forward to seeing y'all then.
$90 for people that have 2 3 sessions. Doesn't only be available.
Oh,
It's not available to the library, it's not available to Kindle, it's not available to any, I have a whole bunch of favorite places I can look.
Well, I have a copy if you ever want to talk about it.
Okay, no, but then I don't read it,
Right.
but why is this?
So I have a question, because we do have meeting for our psych class, the other psych class tomorrow.
Yep, yep.
I liked what the other class, or the other group did with the dementia with this case study.
Yeah, yeah,
So I had talked to my group and I asked if it was okay if I did like a personal case study, because
sure.
my parents sent me like all of my records and everything.
Oh, nice.
So like, I found out like a ton of the studies that we learned in class that I had like you, like through my school.
Oh,
I had,
cool.
which is really cool that I actually had to meet with a school psychologist, and that's my goal, to be a school psychologist.
That's
so, like,
awesome.
my like, it's like wrapping around.
Right,
everything.
right.
But I don't know if like how to set up it correctly. And I don't know